Welcome to our second Holocaust program today. My name is Julie, and I'm an educator with the Eisenhower Foundation here in Abilene, Kansas. This program takes a look at the Holocaust through a picture book, Rose Blanche. There are many books about the Holocaust that relate experiences of the victims in both fiction and nonfiction genres. Rose Blanche is a historical fiction book that takes a slightly different perspective, that of a young German girl who discovers a terrible secret. Holocaust prisoners in a concentration camp near her village. Her response is one of compassion, but it leads to a tragic result. Through his masterful illustrations, Roberto Innocenti shows the progression of World War II through the eyes of Rose. Let's take a look at the book notes page that goes with this program. If you don't have the book notes page, that's okay. You can just take notes on paper. The illustrations in this book are very powerful, as well as the narrative of the story. As we go through the book, take note of the illustrations of Rose and how Rose changes. Look at how the setting changes too. In the middle column, take note of words or phrases that create a feeling, or maybe some type of foreshadowing. What can you infer from the things you see in the illustrations or read in the text? Also, think about an allegory for the book. An allegory is a work that conveys a moral through symbolic characters and events. So after reading this book, we will decide what the entire book might symbolize or represent. The third column on this sheet focuses on symbolism. A symbol is a physical object, a character, or an event that represents something more abstract. There are several symbols in this story that I've listed on this sheet for you. As we go through the book, I'll be asking your ideas and observations about some of these things. So please use the chat feature to respond and contribute to our discussion. Now, let's meet the illustrator of Rose Blanche. Roberto Innocenti was born in Tuscany, Italy in 1940. World War II impacted him as a small child, as his quote on this slide describes. Let me read it for you. I was a little child when the war passed in front of my door. One day, two very young German soldiers wearing gray uniforms came to our house and begged us to hide them. They probably weren't even 18 years old. We were hiding them in the basement when we saw a German truck passing by, taking away a family. The mother was holding a tiny baby wrapped in a pink blanket. My father did not want to answer my questions, but I knew then that something terrible was happening. Innocenti related part of his experiences in this book, Rose Blanche. Innocenti is a self-taught artist who has worked in art galleries, advertising agencies, and now devotes his time to illustrating books. His book, Rose Blanche, has received several awards. Innocenti's illustrations, as you will see, are full of meaning and symbolism that the text might hint to, but doesn't say outright. Many of his illustrations were inspired from actual events that were captured in photographs. And so we'll be taking a look at that, at some of the photographs that reflect his illustrations. Even though Rose Blanche is a picture book, the story is serious and deals with a very heavy topic, the Holocaust. I'll be asking for your thoughts and feedback throughout the presentation, so get ready with that chat feature. The text was originally written in French and later translated into both English and German. Rose Blanche means white rose in French. And coincidentally, it was also the name of a French resistance group during World War II, that were resisting the Nazi policies. This illustration gives a preview of an event that happens later in the story. So who can we assume that this girl is? Probably Rose, right? What we don't know is where she's going. But we could kind of get a feeling from the setting. How does it make you feel? It's kind of foggy, gray, wet, looks cold. So that gives you some idea of maybe the setting of this story. This story is told in first person. Rose herself is the narrator. So let's begin our story. My name is Rose Blanche. I live in a small town in Germany with narrow streets, old fountains, and tall houses with pigeons on the roofs. One day, the first truck arrived and many men left. They were dressed as soldiers. Winter was beginning. I want you to notice a couple of things in this picture. First, what is the atmosphere in this picture? Looks like lots of cheering, excitement, right? Jubilation. They're certainly embracing Nazism, lots of Nazi flags. Rose is the girl standing in the very front holding a Nazi flag. She has a red bow in her hair. Remember, as we go through the story, to take note of her appearance and how she changes, okay? Also take note of the setting and how it changes too. So kind of take a look at what everything looks like right now. I want to point out the mayor of this town. He is standing in the balcony in between two soldiers in back of the Nazi flag hanging off the balcony. Remember to think about who he reminds you of or what he reminds you of. What did you think about the words or the phrase winter was beginning? Do you think that those words might be significant? Let's think about that as we go on with our story. Innocenti may have taken his inspiration for the illustration from a picture like this. This is a photograph of an old German town called Nuremberg. Old German towns like this had a mixture of brick and stone buildings. They had narrow streets with stones to walk or drive on called cobbles, hence the term cobblestones. Innocenti's reflections reflect the quaint and beautiful architecture of those German towns, which was really a stark contrast to the events of the story and what was really going on there. So in this picture, they're probably celebrating Adolf Hitler's order to invade Russia. That was in June of 1941. Germany defeated all the countries they attacked except Great Britain. So there was great national pride at this time, as you can see with the cheering and parades and marching. Now the trucks follow each other under the school windows. They are full of soldiers we don't know, but they wink at us. They drive tanks that make sparks on the cobblestones. They are so noisy and smell like diesel fuel. They hurt my ears, and I have to hold my nose when they pass by. Sometimes it seems things haven't really changed, but my mother warns me to be careful crossing the street between all the trucks. She says soldiers won't slow down. Lots of times I walk by the river, just looking at it. Branches float along, and sometimes old broken toys. I like the color of the river. It looks like the sky. So, do you think that the war seems to be affecting Rose very much at this point? Do you think that she's aware of the events going on around her? No, she doesn't really seem to be too aware of that. She's kind of oblivious to what the war means or what's going on around her. Was there anything in the text that starts to make you wonder or ask questions? Anything unusual? I was kind of wondering why there are old broken toys floating down the river. Where would those come from? Why would they be in the river? We'll see if we can find any answers to that later on. The trucks are fun to watch. We stand in the doorway as they pass. We don't know where they are going, but we think they're going someplace on the other side of the river. One day, one of them stopped so the soldiers could repair the engine. A little boy jumped from the back of the truck and tried to run away, but the mayor was standing there in the middle of the street. He grabbed the little boy by the collar and brought him back to the truck. Then he smiled at the soldiers without speaking, and they thanked him. The sky was gray. So remember to take notes of the mayor and who or what he might remind you of. Also, I want you to notice the boy in this illustration. We're going to compare him to a photograph. Do you see him in this photograph? So Innocenti recreated the boy from this photograph into his illustration. This photograph is one of the most iconic of the Holocaust. So this was taken in Warsaw, Poland in 1943 during the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. This was an event where the Jewish people fought back to keep their freedom, but eventually had to surrender. Innocenti deliberately used the detail of the surrendering Jewish boy in his story. In 1942, the Nazis implemented something called the final solution. In that, Jews living in the ghettos were transported to extermination camps to be killed, which was why they were protesting. The soldiers climbed back into the truck, doors banged shut, and it pulled away. It happened very fast. I wanted to know where the little boy went. So I watched the truck until it disappeared around the corner. The street was crowded. Kids were playing, there were bicycles and farmers' tractors all over. It was noisy, like every day when school is out. But I walked on the sidewalk, ignoring everyone, and no one saw me. All right, so take a close look at the houses. There have been some very subtle changes. Do you notice them? Do you notice anything that has changed in the houses? Look closely at the windows. Right, some of the windows have been broken out. Another question, why that happened? I walked for a long time past the edge of the town into the open fields where I had never been. The clouds were gray. Everything was frozen. Sometimes I ran. Do you notice the sign that she just ran past? It says verboten. That is a German word that means forbidden. Sounds like she might be going into some dangerous territory here. I followed the tracks into the forest and found a clearing. Look at the expression on her face. How do you think she's feeling? Maybe a little surprised? It does look like maybe she's not quite believing what she's seeing, or she doesn't quite know what she's seeing, maybe. Let's take a look at what she saw. Suddenly, electric barbed wire stopped me. Behind it, there were some children standing still. I didn't know any of them. The youngest said they were hungry. Since I had a piece of bread, I carefully handed it to them through the pointed wires. They all stood in front of long wooden houses. The sun was setting behind the hills. It was windy. I was cold. So this is a photograph of the concentration camp of Auschwitz-Birkenau. Innocenti used photographs like this to get the details of the concentration camp correct. Now, there's only one fence in his story because the camp in his fictional town was probably much smaller than Auschwitz. It was not unusual for camps to be built on the edge of a settlement and for the German inhabitants to claim afterwards that they were totally unaware of what was going on. The Nazis tried to keep concentration camps a secret. Weeks passed by in the pale winter. Rose Blanche's appetite surprised her mother. She took more to school than she ate at home. All the bread and butter she could carry, even more jam and apples from the cellar. Can you make any inferences about what she's doing with this food? Do you think she's eating it? Rose Blanche was getting thinner. In town, only the mayor was staying fat. Everyone watched everyone else. Rose Blanche hid her food in her school bag and sneaked out of school early. So what does this tell us about the living conditions in Germany right now? So Rose is getting thinner, only the mayor is staying fat. So I think we can infer that the German people are probably suffering. They probably don't have enough to eat, correct? And as we look at Rose, we notice that her appearance is changing. As it says, she's getting thinner. Also during this time, anyone who disagreed with Adolf Hitler's government could be arrested. Neighbors could secretly report on neighbors to the secret police. I also want you to notice that the story has now switched to the third person. So Rose is no longer telling this story. Think about why the author chose to do that. By now, she knew the road by heart. There were more children by the wooden houses, and they were also getting thinner behind the barbed wire fence. Some of them had a star pinned on their shirts. It was bright yellow. This is a picture of the yellow star that the Jewish people were made to wear during the 1930s and 1940s by the Nazis. The letters say Jew in German. This is a Star of David, which is a traditional religious symbol of Judaism. But by wearing the star, the Jews could be easily seen, segregated, and monitored by the Nazis. You may have also noticed that the prisoners in the story are wearing striped uniforms. Prisoners were dressed in striped uniforms to make them all look the same. Innocenti was careful to get the details of the prisoners' uniforms correct for his story. When the snow melted and the streets were very muddy, the trucks full of weary soldiers drove only at night. This time in the other direction. They were coming with no lights on from the far side of the river, and they never stopped. All right, are you taking note of Rose's appearance? It's changing, isn't it? Right. And how is the setting changing as well? What does the description of the soldiers and how they are traveling indicate? They're going in the opposite direction, so they're going away from the fighting now. They're driving at night without lights so that they're not spotted or noticed. and they're very weary. So it makes me think the war is not going well for Germany at this point. One morning, all the people of the town fled, carrying pots and burlap bags and chairs. There were soldiers among them. Some had torn uniforms, some were limping, some were in pain and asking for water. Rose Blanche disappeared that day. She had walked into the forest again. In this picture, I want you to notice the woman in the forefront in the black. That is Rose Blanche's mother. I imagine she's probably looking for Rose at this point, right? Everyone is scrambling to leave. And where is Rose? Can you find the mayor in this picture? He is getting into the car. What is different about him? How does he look different than he has in the rest of the book? He doesn't have his uniform on anymore, does he? He doesn't have his Nazi armband on. It looks like maybe he's trying to distance himself from the Nazi regime. In the spring of 1945, thousands of Germans left their homes as Russian troops invaded Germany. Innocenti's illustration reflects the chaos and the panic, the style of clothing that was worn at that time, the goods that they were carrying, and the means of transport used by the desperate German people. Fog had erased the road. Rose Blanche was hopping around the mud puddles to keep her shoes clean. In the middle of the woods, the clearing had changed. It was empty. Rose Blanche dropped her school bag full of food. She stood still. Shadows were moving between the trees. It was hard to see them. Soldiers saw the enemy everywhere. There was a shot. At that moment in town, some other soldiers arrived. Their trucks and their tanks were also noisy, and they smelled like diesel oil. But their uniforms were a different color, and they spoke a different language. So if you look at the tank up at the top of the picture, there's a red star on it. Which army was represented with a red star? The USSR, right? So the Soviet Union has invaded their town. And my goodness, look how the town has changed. It's not the jubilant, beautifully kept town that we saw on the first page, is it? In early 1945, Allied troops led by Supreme Allied Commander Dwight Eisenhower entered Germany. By mid-April, the Soviets had encircled the German capital of Berlin. On April 30th, 1945, it was announced that Adolf Hitler had killed himself. The German armed forces surrendered unconditionally on May 7th, 1945, bringing an end to World War II in Europe. Rose Blanche's mother waited a long time for her little girl. The crocuses finally sprang up from the ground. The river swelled and overflowed its banks. Trees were green and full of birds. Spring sang. So this last illustration has kind of a dried up flower hanging off the barbed wire fence. Do you recognize that flower? That was the flower that Rose was holding in the clearing. So what can we infer happened to Rose? There were soldiers. A shot rang out. So she was probably caught in the crossfire. and died. I have a question for you. Would you have responded to the concentration camp prisoners in the same way as Rose if you were in her shoes? Would you have done the same thing? It was very dangerous. I wonder if Rose ever knew the danger that she was in. She was a pretty young girl. Um, from what we gathered, she didn't really understand what was going on with the war, what was happening. People at that time who were caught helping Jewish people were often arrested and killed, but that didn't stop many of them from trying to help. Let's discuss some of the ideas you put in your book notes. What did you notice about Rose and the setting as the story progressed? She definitely got thinner, right? She grew more pale. Eventually, her red bow disappeared, correct? And as we saw with the setting, by the end of the story, the town had been completely demolished and was just in a shambles, wasn't it? What words did you note that created a sense of foreshadowing or created a feeling? The very beginning, remember we talked about it was winter, and that's kind of makes us feel like we're in for the long haul, right? The cold, maybe despair. I also noticed the words, the sky was gray and no one saw me. She was talking about when she slipped out to follow the truck to the concentration camp. And at that point, she kind of became invisible, didn't she? She was kind of growing thinner and more pale. And even at the end, the soldiers didn't see her. The clouds were gray. Everything was frozen. Definitely a very cold feeling. The pale winter. That kind of reminded me of Rose. She was growing pale. The winter was growing pale. And then spring sprang. The war was over. There seemed to be new hope. Grass was growing. Flowers were growing. What symbolism did you attach to the characters or items listed on the sheet? Rose was definitely a symbol of innocence, compassion. She was naive. I don't think she ever realized what was going on around her. The mayor, did he remind you a little bit of Adolf Hitler? Right. He was definitely an authority figure. He had privilege, as we found out, as the townspeople were going hungry, he was staying fat. So his connections to the Nazi party were being repaid to him. The army trucks were kind of the noise and disruption of war. The seasons marked the passage of time. As winter went on, we noticed that the war was progressing. The Germans were suffering more. The army was showing signs that the war was not going well for the German army. Winter kind of symbolized despair. Spring symbolizes hope. The soldiers were kind of the oppressors. They were the forces of violence and injustice. And how about the children of the camp? What do you think they symbolized? They were the victims. They symbolized innocence, vulnerability, right? So how about an allegory? What allegory or moral can we kind of match with this story? It definitely talks a lot about injustice, doesn't it? So the consequences of bearing witness to injustice, Some people who help those are experiencing injustice often experience injustice themselves, as Rose did. She didn't deserve to die at the end. Also, the topic of helping others in the face of danger. Even though you are in danger, helping those who need help. Let's meet some others who helped in the face of danger during the Holocaust. So those people are called rescuers. They're ordinary people who risked their lives to help Jewish people during World War II. Johanna Eck was a Belgian housewife who hid Jews in her small apartment. Elizabeth Abegg was a German school teacher who secretly hid Jewish people in her apartment. And she went short of food herself to feed them. Irina Sendler smuggled Jewish children out of the Warsaw Ghetto. This would have been extremely dangerous. If the German guards caught Jewish people outside of the ghetto, they usually just shot them on the spot and anyone helping them. Lori and Albert Harder hid 3 Jewish women who escaped the Nazis in 1945. There were Nazis living nearby, and neighbors threatened to tell the police or government what Lori and Albert were doing. Cecilia Lutz was the director of a private school in the Netherlands, and she hid Jewish children and adults in the school. Adolf and Marie Althoff ran a traveling circus, and they gave Jews jobs in the circus and kept them safe throughout the war. Complete stories of these rescuers and many others can be found at vadyasham.org. It's also a great resource to find other information about the Holocaust. All of these people made the choice to do what they could to help those who were being mistreated and whose lives were in danger. They made an impact for good during a time of great evil. Before we go, are there any other comments or questions? Well, thank you for joining me for this program today. For more information about other programs we offer, you can access our Educator's Guide at the website above or by using the QR code. We hope to see you again soon. Goodbye.